The Persian literature. Persian derives from Latin Persia and from Greek Persis. It comprises oral compositions and written text in the Persian language, and it is one of the world's oldest literatures. It spans over 2.5 millennia. Persian language has historically been either the native or official language. The literary form of New Persian is known as Farsi in Iran, where it is the country's official language, and as Dari in Afghanistan, where it and Pashto are official language. It is written with Cyrillic alphabet by Tajiks in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. For centuries, New Persian has also been a prestigious cultural language in Western Central Asia, on the Indian subcontinent, and in Turkey. Classical Persian literature was produced almost entirely under royal patronage, whence the frequency of panegyric verse. An influence of at least equal strength was religion, and in particular was Sufism, which inspired the remarkably high proportion of mystical poetry. Classical Persian poetry is always rhymed. Persian literature is the jewel in the crown of Persian culture. It has profoundly influenced the literatures of Ottoman Turkey, Muslim India, and Turkic Central Asia, and been a source of inspiration of Goethe, Emerson, Matthew Arnold, and George Louis Borges, among others. Yet Persian literature has never received the attention it truly deserves. The former name of Iran was Persia, which was in use till 1935. Iran has been referred to as Persia by the West, due mainly to the writings of Greek historians who called Iran Persis, meaning land of the Persians. And for Iran, it literally means land of the Aryans. Iran is one of the world's oldest continuous major civilization, with historical and urban settlements dating back to 4000 BC. During 1500s BC, it was occupied by Medes and Persians. 525 BC, King Cyrus the Great became ruler of the Achaemenid Empire, overthrew Medes. 331 BC, Persia fell to Alexander, while on 312 BC, it was under Seleucids. 247 BC, when Greeks started to speak Persians, while during 224 BC was the Sasanians, while on 641 BC was the Arab Muslims. Then on 12th century, they were invaded by the Mongols. 1501 till 1722 was the Safavid dynasty. Then 1794 to 1925 was the Kahar dynasty. Farsi is still spoken in Tajikistan and Afghanistan. It was the official court language of India for 200 years. The largest ethnic group of Iran is Persian, constituting about 51% of the population, and the majority of the population of Iran is Shiite Muslim. Persian literature was little known in the West before the 19th century. It became much better known following the publication of several translations from the works of late medieval Persian poets, and it inspired works by various Western poets and writers. Not all Persian literature is written in Persian, as some consider works written by ethnic Persians in other languages such as Greek and Arabic to be included. At the same time, not all literature written in Persian, is written by ethnic Persians or Iranians, as Turkic, Caucasian, and Indic poets and writers have also used the Persian language in the environment of Persianate cultures. So here are the example of the Arabic alphabet. While this one is how Persian alphabet sounds like.
B, P, T, D, J, Ç, H, X, Dal, Dal, R, Z, J, Sin, Shin, Sad, Zad, Ta, Za, Ayn, Qayn, F, Qaf, Kaf, Qaf, Lam, Mim, Nun, Vav, He, Ye.
While here's the sound of Persian numbers.
1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10.
While the Greek alphabet is also included from the Persian literature. Iranians wrote in both Persian and Arabic. Persian predominated in later literary circles. Persian poets such as Ferdowsi, Sadi, Hafiz, Attar, Nizami, Rumi, and Omar Khayyam are also known in the West and have influenced the literature of many countries.
Omar Khayyam is a Persian mathematician, astronomer, and poet renowned in his own country in time for his scientific achievements, but chiefly known to English-speaking readers through a translation of collection of his Rubaiyat. In the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam in 1859 by the English writer Edward Fitzgerald. Omar's fame in the West rests upon the collection of Rubaiyat or quatrains attributed to him. Omar's poems had attracted comparatively little attention until they inspired Fitzgerald to write his celebrated The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, containing such now famous phrases as a jug of wine, a loaf of bread, and dough. Take the cash and let the credit go, and the flower that once has blown forever dies. These quatrains have been translated into almost every major language and are largely responsible for coloring European ideas about Persian poetry. Scholars have doubted that Omar wrote poetry. His contemporaries took no notice of his verse, and not until 2 centuries after his death did a few quatrains appear under his name. Even then, the verses were mostly used as quotations against particularly views ostensibly held by Omar, leading some scholars to suspect that they may have been invented and attributed to Omar because of his scholarly reputation. The verses translated by Fitzgerald and others reveal a man of deep thought, troubled by the questions of the natures of reality and the eternal, the impermanence and uncertainty of life, and man's relationship to God. The writer doubts the existence of divine providence and the afterlife, derides religious certainty, and feels keenly man's frailty and ignorance. Finding no acceptance answers to the perplexities, he chooses to put his faith instead of joyful appreciation of fleeting and sensuous beauties of material world. The idyllic nature of the modest pleasures he celebrates, however, cannot dispel his honest and straightforward brooding over fundamental and metaphysical questions.
Persian lyric poet Hafiz, also known as Khwaja Samsuddin Muhammad Hafiz Isirazi, grew up in Shiraz. Very little is known about his life, but it is thought that he may have memorized the Quran after hearing his father recite passages. When his father died, he left school to work at a bakery and as a copyist. Hafiz became a poet at the court of Abu Ishaq and also taught at a religious college. He is one of the most celebrated of the Persian poets, and his influence can be felt to this day. As the author of numerous ghazals expressing love, spirituality, and protest, he and his work continue to be important to Iranians, and many of his poems are used as proverbs or sayings. The best Hafiz poems are All the Hemispheres, From the Large Junk Drink, I Have Learned So Much, Let Thought Become Your, Laughing at the Word Too, I Know the Way You Can Get, I've said it before and I'll say it again. Tired of speaking sweetly, like the morning breeze, we might have to medicate you, a potted plant, and no more living. Rumi, or Jalal ad-Din Rumi, also called by the honorific Maulana, was born on September 30, 1207 in Balkh and died on December 17, 1273 in Konya. The greatest Sufi mystic and poet in the Persian language, famous for his lyrics and for his didactic epic Masnavi Manavi, or the spiritual couplets, which widely influenced mystical thought and literature throughout the Muslim world. After his death, his disciples were organized as the Maulaviya order. Rumi's use of Persian and Arabic in his poetry, in addition to some Turkish and less Greek, has resulted in his being claimed variously for Turkish literature and Persian literature, a reflection of the strength of his influence in Iran and Turkey. The influence of his writings in the Indian subcontinent is also substantial. By the end of the 20th century, his popularity had become a global phenomenon, with his poetry achieving a wide circulation in Western Europe and the United States. Rumi's poems and poetry are A Moment of Happiness, A Stone I Died, All Through Eternity, Any Lifetime, Any Soul That Drank the Nectar, At the Twilight, Be Lost in the Call, Be with Those Who Need Your Being, Because I Cannot Sleep, Bird Song, Book 1 Prologue, Bring Wine, Come, come, whoever you are, Confused and Distraught, Description of Love, Did I Not Say to You, and Every Day I Bear a Burden.
Now let's move on to Ferdowsi. Ferdowsi was born in Khorasan in a village near Tuus in 135 CE. His great epic, the Shahnameh, or the Epic of Kings, to which he devoted most of his adult life, was originally composed for the Samanid princes of Khorasan, who were the chief instigators of the revival of Persian cultural traditions after the Arab conquest of the 7th century. During Ferdowsi's lifetime, this dynasty was conquered by the Ghaznavid Turks, and there are various stories in medieval texts describing the lack of interest shown by the new ruler of Khorasan, Mahmud of Ghaznavi, in Ferdowsi and his life work. Ferdowsi is said to have died around 1020 CE in poverty and embittered by royal neglect, though confident of his and his poems' ultimate fame. The Shahnameh, or the Epic of Kings, is one of the definite classics of the world. It tells hero tales of ancient Persia. The contents and the poet's style in describing the events takes the readers back to the ancient times and makes he or she sense and feel the events. Ferdowsi worked for 30 years to finish this masterpiece. Ferdowsi is considered as the greatest Persian poet, author of the Shahnameh, or the Epic of Kings, the Persian national epic to which he gave its final and enduring form, although he based his poem mainly on an earlier prose version. For nearly 1,000 years, the Persians have continued to read and to listen to recitations from his masterwork, in which the Persian national epic found its final and enduring form. It is the history of Iran's glorious past, preserved for all time in sonorous and majestic verse. Though written about 1,000 years ago, this work is as intelligible to the average modern Iranian as the King James Version of the Bible is to a modern English speaker. The language, based as the poem is on a Pahlavi original, is pure Persian with only the slightest admixture of the Arabic. According to Nizami, Ferdowsi was a Deccan or a landowner, deriving a comfortable income from his estates. He had only one child, a daughter, and it was up to provide her with a dowry that he set his hand to the task that was to occupy him for more than 30 years. The Shahnameh of Ferdowsi, a poem of nearly 60,000 couplets, is based mainly on a prose work of the same name compiled in the poet's nearly manhood in his native Tus. This prose Shahnameh was in turn and for the most part of the translation of a Pahlavi work, the Kabnatay Namak, a history of the kings of Persia from mythical times down to the reign of Khosrow II, 590 to 628 CE. But it also contained additional material continuing the story of the overthrow of the Sasanians by the Arabs in the middle of the 7th century AD. The first to undertake the versification of this chronicle of pre-Islamic and legendary Persia was the Kiki, a poet at the court of the Samanids, who came to a violent end after completing only 1,000 verses. These verses, which deal with the rise of the Prophet Zoroaster, were afterward incorporated by Ferdowsi with due acknowledgments in his own poem. An important feature of this work is that during the period that Arabic language was known as the main language of science and literature, Ferdowsi used only Persian in his masterpiece. As Ferdowsi himself says, Persian language is revived by this work. Ferdowsi's tomb in Tuus near Mashhad the Shahnameh, finally completed in 1010 CE, was presented to the celebrated Sultan Mahmud of Ghaznavi, who by that time had made himself master of Ferdowsi's homeland, Khorasan. Information on the relations between poet and the patron is largely legendary. According to Nizami, Ferdowsi came to Ghazna in person, and through the good offices of the minister, Ahmad Ibn Hassan Maimandi was able to secure the Sultan's acceptance of the poem. Unfortunately, Mahmud then consulted certain enemies of the minister as to the poet's reward. They suggested that Ferdowsi should be given 50,000 dirhams, and even this, they said, was too much in view of his heretical Shiite tenets. Mahmud, a bigoted Sunnite, was influenced by their words, and in the end, Ferdowsi received only 20,000 dirhams. Bitterly disappointed, he went to the bath and on coming out, bought a draught of hoka, it's a kind of beer, and divided the whole of the money between the bath attendant and the seller of hoka. Fearing the Sultan's wrath, he fled first to Herat, where he was in hiding for 6 months, and then by way of his native Tus to Mazandaran, where he found refuge at the court of the Sepabad Shahriyar, whose family claimed descent from the last of Sasanians. Ferdowsi composed a satire of 100 verses on Sultan Mahmud that he inserted in the preface of the Shahnameh and read it to Shahryar, at the same time offering to dedicate the poem to him as a descendant of the ancient kings of Persia instead of to Mahmud. Shahryar, however, persuaded him to leave the dedication to Mahmud, bought the satire from him for 1,000 dirhams a verse, and had it expunged from the poem. The whole text of this satire, bearing every mark of authenticity, has survived to the present. According to the narrative of Nizami, Ferdowsi died inopportunely just as Sultan Mahmud had determined to make amends for his shabby treatment of the poet by sending him 60,000 dinars worth of indigo. Nizami does not mention the date of Ferdowsi's death. The earliest date given by later authorities is 1020 and the latest is 1026 CE. It is certain that he lived to be more than 80.